your favorite album will probably be an album that you hate the first time you hear it.
That's the definition of the avant-garde, right? There's some kind of like culturally progressive force, but then there's also a like willingness to experiment with a new tool, new piece of technology.
So media consumption has been individualized. Subculture has been individualized and commodified. The cautionary tale of my last record, which was essentially like, don't get red pilled and black pilled. Try normal life maxing.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Maddie Healy, a musician, an artist, and the frontman of the 1975.
My work has always kind of served as like a cautionary tale for emerging technologies, how we're communicating, all within the context of what traditional pop music will talk about, you know, like love, relationships and stuff like that. I'm sure we'll talk about my last show, which was kind of a cautionary tale about the situation we have with young men who are dealing with articulating a kind of a modern form of masculinity, and how maybe the left, which I'm historically a part of, doesn't quite have the equipment to bring in these or capitalize on this group of floundering young men because, you know,
we don't have the language for it.
We don't have the language, and also we don't have the archetypes.
We didn't have tools like professional managerial class. I mean, we had them from 1971. They existed, but they weren't in popular use. They weren't colloquial terms that people could like, that's like PMC.
We're in a different society now where it's all about self-actualization. It's all about becoming the most best authentic version of yourself.
Right.
Without any institutions to kind of guide you of how to do that, it's difficult, right? A lot of young men will find a Jordan Peterson video, not to talk shit on any particular academic. I'm not a very partisan person, but you will get people who will be like, basically understand that idea of being like, oh, you're a man who wants to be a man.
Right.
Here's literally 12 rules of how to do, you know what I mean? So it's, so
only 12.
Only
12. Sounds actually quite easy to do.
So my last show was in part kind of a traditional rock show and in part a performance art piece that kind of operated a bit like a play in its first act and a traditional rock show in its second act. And the first act came from the COVID years and me becoming single over that time and basically starting to consume from what started out as a kind of interested, a perspective of being interested in these subcultures of internet. And I started being fed all of this algorithmic kind of extremism.
They got you targeted.
They got me targeted.
Yeah.
So luckily there's people like us that can kind of see that as an objective phenomena and not be too influenced by it. But I became aware of how influential it was. And I basically was trying to navigate of how not to get caught up in that world. So
the one thing I would add to this, because we tend to use these words like extreme and fringe and so on, but we're in a unique period of society and history where we actually have quantitative metrics about how many people watch this stuff. And the question I keep asking guests who come onto this podcast is, how do we describe something that is fringe, subcultural, or outside the mainstream if it is quantitatively larger than the mainstream?
Right.
Is there something that we need to redefine here? Like if everybody is watching this, like maybe that just is actually the new extreme, the new mainstream, and it is not extreme. It is not fringe.
This is the problem that we'll get into in a little bit. Yeah, you're totally right that anything that becomes, listen, consumer capitalism understands trends better than anybody.
Yes, it does,
as soon as something is alternative, it becomes immediately corrupted by the mainstream.
Yeah.
Now you see that in music a lot now. In its most, I think, extreme way, you have these, I'm going to single anybody out, but I'm sure you can imagine who it is. There's this group of, TikTok punks, essentially.
TikTok punks.
Well, kind of, there's this new scene of very overtly alternative artists in the way that we would describe somebody who's gone to Hot Topic. Do you know what I mean? And we're in this weird place where for their young audience, they are presenting these ideas as kind of, and these aesthetics, chains, skirts, doing that, being alternative in the way we were 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And they're basically presenting authenticity as just another commodity in an aesthetic. So the fact that they are fuck the man, but all signed to like Island Records. And they're also referencing Sid Vicious in the same sentence that they reference Good Charlotte and Avril Lavigne. Now, our generation knows that that version of punk was a bunch of white dudes in suits going, oh, people like Silverchair and Nirvana, we need a pop version. And that's where you got like your kind of early 2000s alternative music, which were all the biggest artists in the world. You know what I mean?
And would you say that part of the rise of this new kind of reactionary online culture has to do with that commodification of the like counterculture, the idea of punk that you and I both grew up with? And if that is now mainstream and sold to you through like Hot Topic and everything else, then it's kind of not surprising that like the inverse of that then feels like a little bit more dangerous.
Well, it's weird for me because as I've gotten older, I think I've been able to articulate these ideas a lot better, but I've been feeling them for a long time. So for example, when I started the band became known in this very, very interesting transition or kind of passing of the baton from traditional linear media institutions to social media, which was, so you basically used to have the enemy that would choose a band, put them on the front cover, give you one song and say, this is your new favorite band.
I'll define for the audience the performance piece that was really a centerpiece of your last live show involved beginning with a plate of what appeared to be a healthy, hefty portion of raw meat, which you proceeded to consume in front of the audience. You then do a bit of a workout routine. You're doing some shirtless push-ups in the beginning. Behind you is what appears to be, I mean, I would not be surprised to see this performance in an art gallery or a museum. This was just a piece of performance art in the middle of a rock show. There's a wall of TVs behind you. They're playing what appears to be protest footage, different news clips. I recognize a few faces from kind of the conservative alternative media sphere. And towards the end of this, you literally crawl through the television screen and go down the rabbit hole, so to speak. So I thought it was a beautiful piece of performance art. I thought it was very empathetic. I thought it was an interesting way to explore the phenomena of masculinity that I know both you and I are very interested in, especially in the last few years. Like, we're both kind of artsy, creative types. We were not like macho jocks in high school.
Yeah, we were beaten up for being gay.
Yes, exactly. And I wasn't even gay in high school.
This is the whole thing. And I had I had long hair and that was enough.
Exactly. And now it's like these things have all been like thoroughly redefined, and it's a kind of interesting media experiment, but then also a kind of like interesting social experience just to see how the definition of masculinity has shifted within that period. And so you were exploring this through art. It naturally went absurdly viral on TikTok and a number of other places. And the public reaction to that has been kind of an interesting real-time test of, all of these different media theories at once.
It made me aware of this new culture that Brad Trammell, for people watching, which is
our good
friend, who wrote part of the show with me. The phenomena that he coined as literalism.
Yes.
So this idea of I consume the art and the moral values within the art adhere to mine, and the person who's making the art therefore aligns with me morally and socially.
Right.
Now, art used to be less of a mirror and more of a door that we opened, And if you look at like the 90s with your kind of the culture of Gen X, they were very interested in opening as many doors as possible to see what their limits were and then going, I'm good with that. But not that shouldn't happen.
Right.
So what I thought was interesting is that for me, it was obvious what I was doing from an artistic perspective. But to a lot of people, even people with context, it was quite confusing. And I think that the reason it was confusing nowadays is because, let's call it a meme culture. So the primary discourse in like youth culture now is kind of through memes. So it's sharing these images or these ideas that are immediately very understandable and relatable.
Yes.
So if you consume something now within that environment, be it in a ClearNet environment, TikTok or something
ClearNet is, for the audience, big open social media platforms that are free to use, that are driven by advertising. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter,
YouTube,
anything you don't have to
Google.
pay to post. There's no paywall, and etc. So ClearNet, everyone can see it.
Yeah, and we'll get into that later, that underneath that you have this kind of dark forest with emerging kind of platforms, and then the one that we all know underneath that is the dark web.
A topology of internet culture. So
So
we'll get into this, but ClearNet right now are just like big open social media.
So,
and the responses are driven a lot by attention.
By attention and by incentive as well. So you have lots of phenomena that we know about in regards to, I wasn't playing any good or bad character. I was trying to be as objective in my performance about, listen, this is not where you want to end up. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So I would be doing these things that were, I think when you look at them on the screen, quite provocative, but a part of the show felt a little bit more surreal and kind of acceptable because you were in an environment where you were there to watch art. You weren't like in your kitchen.
Yes.
And I think that when you're exposed to things that require context or are supposed to elicit a real conversation in an environment that isn't really about that, you get all of these emerging phenomena happening.
Would you say that part of the conversation that ensued online was perhaps a fulfillment of the piece? To provoke these conversations to be had in the first place?
And it also got into a problem that basically there would be all of this conversation around what I was doing, why I was doing it, and what it meant. So everyone knows that that's kind of the point of performance art, to generate a conversation which becomes part of the art itself. So I learned very much in the early days of social media that you can kind of control a narrative, right? You can control the conversation that you want to be had around you fairly well. The weird thing about that show is that every other performance like that, a performance in a gallery, a theater performance, a movie, a stand-up comedy thing, you can't film it. You're not allowed to film it. A rock show, you were invited to film it. So I had this scripted thing that on day 2 went live to the whole world. So I had to kind of keep rewriting it. So then I was reacting to what was being said. So it was becoming this quite like meta kind of thing. And this is something that you can relate to. So me and you used to, with our social media and stuff, and I think me from A Brief Inquiry onwards, we would draw from the most extreme parts of the internet.
Yes.
And we would post about them because we found that culture interesting, and we
shadow banned over and over.
All these kind of things. Now, what we were doing was presenting this new phenomena of behavior and asking people to engage with us in a conversation of what it was about, whether we make art about it and stuff like that.